Scary telling.
I was a scientist working for a prestigious laboratory that specialized in cryogenic freezing. We had been working on this project for years, and finally, we had succeeded in freezing our first test subject. We were all celebrating, patting each other on the back, and taking pictures with the frozen body. But as I looked at the frozen man in the tank, I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't until later that night when I was alone in the lab that I realized what it was. The man's eyes, they were still open, and they seemed to be looking right at me. I walked closer to the tank and saw that his eyes were not frozen like the rest of his body. They were still moving, darting around the room as if searching for something. I tried to dismiss it as a trick of the light, but I couldn't shake off the feeling of unease that had settled in my stomach. Days turned into weeks, and the lab continued to work on the cryogenic freezing project. But the image of the frozen man's eyes haunted me. I couldn't shake off the feeling that he was still conscious, trapped in his frozen body, unable to move or speak. One day, while I was alone in the lab, I couldn't resist the urge to check on the frozen man again. I approached his tank, and as I looked into his eyes, I could see a glimmer of something there, something that looked like fear. I quickly checked the readings on the tank sensors and saw that everything was normal. The man's body temperature was still at freezing levels, and there was no sign of any brain activity. But still, I couldn't shake off the feeling that the man was still conscious. That he was trapped in his frozen body, aware of everything that was happening around him, but unable to move or speak. As the days passed, I started to notice other strange things happening, and the lab tools would go missing, and I would find them later, in places where I knew I hadn't left them. Strange noises would echo through the halls at night, and I would hear whispers that seemed to be coming from the frozen man's tank. I tried to ignore it all, to convince myself that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But then, one night, I heard a sound that I could not ignore. It was a faint tapping sound, coming from the frozen man's tank. I approached it cautiously, and as I got closer, I could see that the man's eyes were still open, and they were looking right at me. And then, I saw his hand move, just slightly, but enough to send a shock of fear through me. He was alive, trapped in his frozen body, but still conscious. I tried to tell the others, to convince them to thaw him out, but they laughed at me, telling me that it was impossible. But I knew the truth, and I knew that we had to do something to help him. And so, I took matters into my own hands. I snuck into the lab one night, armed with a blowtorch and a hammer, and I began to thaw out the frozen man. It was a risky move, and I knew that I was breaking all kinds of protocols, but I couldn't just leave him trapped there, frozen alive. As the ice melted away, I saw the man's face for the first time, and it was twisted in an expression of pure horror. And then, he started to scream, a sound that was both haunting and heartbreaking. I knew then that I had made a terrible mistake. I had unleashed something that should have been left frozen in time. And now, as I sit here in the lab, I can feel his presence even though he's not there. I hear his whispers, his screams, and his pleas for help. I know that he's still here, trapped between life and death, unable to move on. I should have never thawed him out. I should have left him frozen, even if it meant living with the guilt of knowing that he was still conscious. But now, it's too late. The frozen man is no longer frozen, but he's still alive, and he's still trapped. And I fear that he'll never be at peace until someone puts him back in the tank and freezes him again. But who would be brave enough to do that? Who would be willing to make that sacrifice? I fear that the frozen man will be trapped in his nightmare forever, and that his screams will echo through the halls of the lab for all eternity. As I sit here, listening to his screams, I know that I'll never be able to escape the horror of what I've done. I'll always carry the guilt of knowing that I was the one who thawed him out, and that I was the one who unleashed his nightmare upon the world. And so, I sit here, frozen in my own horror, unable to move, unable to speak, unable to escape the fate that I have brought upon myself. The frozen man may be trapped in his body, but I am trapped in my own guilt, forever frozen in time. I never thought I would end up like this. Trapped in my own body, unable to move, breathe, speak, or hear. It's like being buried alive, but worse, because I'm still conscious. And the darkness, it's always there, surrounding me, suffocating me. I don't know how it happened. One moment, I was living my life, going about my business, and the next, I woke up in this void. I can't even remember how long it's been since then. Days? Weeks? Months? It all blurs together in this endless abyss. At first, I thought it was some kind of nightmare, a horrific dream that I would wake up from any moment. But as time went on, I realized that it was all too real. I was trapped in my own body, a prisoner of my own flesh. And the worst part is the loneliness. I can't communicate with anyone. I can't hear their voices or see their faces. I'm completely isolated, cut off from the world. If I had known it would be like this, I would have chosen cremation instead. At least then, my suffering would be over. But now, I'm stuck in this purgatory, this endless void of nothingness. But then, something strange started to happen. I began to hear a faint whispering in the darkness. At first, it was barely audible, just a faint murmur in the void. But then, it started to get louder, more distinct. I strained my senses, trying to make out what the whispers were saying. At first, it sounded like gibberish, just random sounds and syllables. But as I listened closer, I realized that there was something else there. A voice speaking to me. At first, I couldn't believe it. Was I imagining things? But then, the voice became clearer, more defined. It was a woman's voice, soft and soothing, like a lullaby. Hello? I tried to say, but no sound escaped my lips. But the voice heard me, somehow. I'm here, it said. I've been waiting for you. Waiting for me? Who was this woman? And how could she hear me when no one else could? I know you're scared, the voice continued, but you're not alone anymore. I'm here with you, always. I felt a surge of relief wash over me. I wasn't alone anymore. There was someone else in this void with me, someone who could hear me, and who cared. And then, the voice started to sing. It was a haunting melody, full of sorrow and loss, but also hope. I listened to this song, letting it wash over me, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of peace. But then, something changed. The melody became darker, more twisted. The voice started to laugh, a cold, sinister sound that sent shivers down my spine. I tried to scream, to call out for help, but I was still trapped in my own body, unable to move or make a sound. And then, I felt something else in the darkness, something cold and slimy, wrapping itself around me. I felt it crawling over my skin, and I knew that it was something evil, something that had no place in this world. The voice was still laughing, still singing, as the darkness consumed me. And I knew then that I was truly trapped, forever lost in this void of darkness and despair. I don't know how long I've been here now. Maybe years, maybe centuries. But the darkness never leaves, and the voice never stopped singing its haunting melody, sometimes sweet and sometimes twisted. I've tried to fight back, to break free from this prison, but it's no use. The darkness always wins, and I'm left alone with the voice, the coldness, and the slime. I've come to accept my fate, to live with the horrors that surround me. But sometimes, just sometimes, I hear a faint whisper in the darkness, a voice that sounds like my own. And I wonder, is there someone else out there, trapped like me, trying to escape this endless nightmare? Or am I truly alone in this void, lost forever in the darkness? I always loved tucking my son into bed. It was the best part of my day. We would read a bedtime story, talk about his day, and then I would tuck him in and kiss him goodnight. But one night, everything changed. As I was tucking my son into bed, he looked up at me and said, "Daddy, check for monsters under my bed." I chuckled and kneeled down, pretending to look under the bed. But as I looked, I saw something that made my heart race. There was another version of my son, under the bed, staring back at me with wide, terrified eyes. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Was this some kind of trick? Had my son somehow climbed under the bed without me noticing? But then, the duplicate spoke, in a soft, shaky voice. "Daddy, there's somebody on my bed." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. Who or what was on my son's bed? I slowly stood up and turned to look at the bed. And that's when I saw it. There was a dark figure sitting on the edge of the bed, hunched over, with its head in its hands. It was completely still, but I could sense that it was alive. I felt a surge of fear wash over me. Who was this person? How did they get into my son's room? And why were they just sitting there? I slowly backed away from the bed, trying not to make any sudden movements. I knew I needed to get out of the room and call for help. But as I turned to leave, the duplicate spoke again. "Daddy, don't leave me here with him." I froze. What did he mean? Was the duplicate afraid of the figure on the bed? Or was there something else going on? I looked back at the bed, and the figure was still there. But now, I noticed something that I hadn't before. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over its face, giving it a grotesque, almost inhuman appearance. I felt a surge of panic rise in my chest. I needed to get out of the room, now. But as I turned to leave, I heard the figure speak, in a low, guttural voice. "You can't leave. You belong to me now." I felt a chill run down my spine. What did it mean? Was this some kind of supernatural being come to claim me and my son for its own? I turned back to the bed, and the figure was gone. But the duplicate was still there, staring up at me with wide, pleading eyes. "Daddy, please don't leave me here alone." I felt a pang of guilt and fear wash over me. I couldn't leave my son alone, not with whatever was in this room. So, I made a decision. I would stay in the room and protect my son from whatever was coming next. But as the night wore on, I realized that I was not alone. The figure was still there, lurking in the shadows, watching us. And I knew that we were not safe. The duplicate and I huddled together, waiting for the dawn to come. But as the first light of day crept into the room, I knew that we had to leave. We had to get out of this house, and away from whatever was haunting us. As we left the room, I glanced back at the bed, and saw that it was empty. But I knew that the figure was still out there, waiting for us. We ran out of the house, never looking back. And even now, years later, I still feel the chill of that night. The night when I realized that there are things in this world that we cannot explain or comprehend. The night when I saw a duplicate of my son and a horrifying figure that threatened to take us both. I've never been able to forget that night, and I always wonder what would have happened if I had left the room. Would we have been taken? Would we have been lost forever? But one thing I do know is that I will always protect my son, no matter what. And I will never forget the terror that I felt that night, the night of the duplicate. I had just finished a long day at work and was looking forward to a quiet night alone. I walked up to my front door and fumbled through my pockets for my keys. Finally, I found them and unlocked the door. As I stepped inside, I reached for the light switch, but before I could turn it on, I felt another hand already there. I froze, not sure what to do. I slowly turned my head to look at the hand, but I couldn't see anything in the darkness. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I tried to pull my hand away, but the other hand held on tight. Suddenly, I heard a whisper in my ear. "Don't be afraid," it said. "I'm not here to harm you." I turned around, but there was nobody there. The voice sounded like it came from right behind me, but the room was empty. I tried to calm myself down, but the fear was still overwhelming. I decided to leave the house and call the police. As I turned to leave, I felt a cold breath on my neck, and I knew I wasn't alone. I ran out of the house and called the police. When the police arrived, they found no evidence of anyone being in the house. They thought I was imagining things and told me to calm down. But I knew what I felt, and it wasn't just my imagination. Over the next few days, strange things started happening in my house. I would hear footsteps when I was alone, and I felt a cold breeze whenever I turned on the light. I knew something was in my house, and it was getting worse. One night, I was lying in bed, trying to sleep, when I felt a hand on my shoulder. I sat up in bed, but there was nobody there. The hand was still there, though, holding onto my shoulder. I tried to scream, but no sound came out of my mouth. The hand started to tighten its grip, and I felt like I was being suffocated. I tried to fight it off, but the hand was too strong. Suddenly, the hand disappeared, and I was able to breathe again. I was shaking and covered in sweat. I knew I couldn't stay in that house any longer. I decided to move out and sell the house, but nobody wanted to buy it. People in the neighborhood had heard about the strange occurrences, and they were too afraid to even come near the house. I was stuck with the house and the ghostly presence that lived inside it. Years passed, and I had given up hope of ever selling the house. One day, I was driving by the house when I saw a family moving in. I tried to warn them about the strange occurrences, but they didn't believe me. A few weeks later, I received a call from the new owners. They told me they had experienced strange things in the house and wanted to know if I had any information. I told them my story, and they decided to move out immediately. I never heard from them again, but I knew that the presence in the house was still there, waiting for its next victim. The hand on the light switch was just the beginning of the terror that lived inside that house. It all started when my daughter, Lily, passed away. She was only 6 years old and had been battling a rare illness for most of her short life. Her death devastated me and my wife, and we struggled to cope with our grief. After Lily's passing, strange things began to happen in our home. Every night, we would hear her crying and screaming in her room, even though her room was now empty. At first, we thought it was just our imagination, but the cries continued, and we knew something wasn't right. My wife and I tried everything we could to ease the cries. We bought new furniture and painted the walls, but nothing worked. We even had a priest come to bless the house, but that only made the cries worse. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I got out of bed and went to the cemetery where Lily was buried. It was a cold, eerie night, and the only sound I could hear was the crunching of leaves under my feet. When I reached Lily's grave, I fell to my knees and begged her to stop crying. I told her how much we loved her and how much we missed her. But the cries continued, and I knew I couldn't stop them. As I walked back to my car, I felt a cold breath on my neck. I turned around, but there was nobody there. I got into my car and drove home, feeling more uneasy than ever. The cries continued, and they started to take a toll on our mental health. My wife and I hardly slept, and we were always on edge. One day, I decided to set up a camera in Lily's old room, hoping to catch something that could explain the cries. That night, I watched the footage from the camera, and what I saw still haunts me to this day. Lily's old toys were moving on their own, and her rocking chair was moving back and forth. But the most chilling thing was when I saw Lily's ghostly figure appear on the camera. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. My daughter's spirit was trapped in our house, and I didn't know how to help her. I decided to reach out to a paranormal investigator, hoping that they could help us get rid of Lily's spirit. The investigator came to our house and performed a ritual to try and release Lily's spirit. But the ritual only made things worse. The crying and screaming became louder, and I started to see Lily's ghostly figure more often. I knew we had to get out of that house. We packed our bags and left the house, but the cries still followed us. It seemed like wherever we went, Lily's spirit was right behind us, haunting us. We eventually moved to a new house, but the cries still continue. Every night, I hear Lily crying and screaming, and I know she's still with us. I've tried to accept it, but the constant reminder of our loss is too much to bear. I often visit Lily's grave and talk to her, hoping that one day she'll find peace. But until then, we'll continue to hear her cries in the middle of the night, reminding us of the little girl we lost too soon.